welcome. My name is Susanna Baruch. Thank you for coming. I am the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. Welcome to historic Austin Hall. And welcome to the Evolutionary Purpose of Adolescent Vulnerability, Decoding and Depathologizing Adolescent Neurobiology and Behavior. We have been working to make this a spectacular event with researcher, physician, and author Dr. Barbara Natterson-Horowitz and Marsha Levick, the Chief Legal Officer and co-founder of the Juvenile Law Center. I just want to say a few words before we kick it off. This event is organized by the Project on Law and Applied Neuroscience, which is a collaboration between the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior and Petrie-Flom, with support from the Oswald D. N. Kamen Fund at Harvard University. I also want to say a special thanks to our co-sponsors, the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management at Harvard's Kennedy School, and the Youth Advocacy and Policy Lab's Child Advocacy Clinic at Harvard Law School. And we are thrilled to be joined by professors and leaders from across the university and to have in the audience guests to Judge Nancy Gertner's classes, who include judges, probation and pretrial officers, and representatives from the Federal Judicial Center. Thank you for coming. Big thank you to the Petrie-Flom team, Laura Chong, Lisa Gorelick, and Erin Lynch, who make everything happen. And to our faculty director, Glenn Cohen. I could not ask for a better boss. This is the 20th anniversary year of the Petrie-Flom Center, and our upcoming events include topics like aging and the law and policy of psychedelic medicine, emerging issues in reproductive health, and global health and rights. Coming up next on May 8th is an online event on mental health and climate change. Students. We have student fellows selected from the law school and other Harvard graduate programs. Our website will tell you how to apply. I hope everyone will check out our twice-monthly newsletter and our widely read blog, Bill of Health, and follow us on social media. There are QR codes at the exit. It is a moment in our nation and world where there is a dizzying amount of very intense news. I personally have found some comfort in work when it involves brilliant and generous colleagues, and Dr. Judith Edersheim is a terrific example of that. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, which brings insights from neuroscience, neurology, and psychiatry into the legal arena in an effort to improve the justice system. We love our work with CLBB, and it's my pleasure to hand this over to Dr. Edersheim to introduce our speakers.
Susanna, thank you for that lovely intro. I'm very happy to see everyone here, lots of friends, and to see our two luminary speakers. I'm going to first frame this event, and then I will introduce our speakers. I'm getting that, make it higher. Not sure I'm talented enough to do that, but we'll see. Okay, there we go. So, adolescence. This is a very evocative word. This single word conjures up a vivid picture of a set of behaviors that accompany the early and later transitions into maturity. Picture the eye roll, the fender bender, the broken curfew, and much more. And if you have forgotten what an eye roll looks like, you can come to our house on any evening. Over the past 50 years, neurobiologists have been able to show the structural and functional brain changes that power these classic adolescent behaviors, dual systems models. Some folks in here invented dual systems models that demonstrates that earlier maturation of limbic systems and later refinement of the prefrontal cortex and greater connectivity produce impulsive and reward-driven behaviors in outsized proportion to impulse control and accurate risk perception. Well, this is law school. Why would we care about such a thing? Well, because this understanding of the brain basis for childhood and emerging adult behavior spurred a legal revolution. The landmark case of Roper v. Simmons, barring the execution of children 18 and under, occurred exactly 20 years ago and set the stage for future cases built on the knowledge, upon this knowledge to develop a jurisprudence recognizing that children are different and should be treated differently in the eyes of the law. However, the law still pathologizes adolescents and treats teenagers as impaired or flawed. Many legal doctrines, particularly in the criminal law, implicitly treat teens as if they have a communicable illness, and they should be isolated until they are cured with brain maturity. But what if teenagers and their brains are supposed to be the way they are? What if adolescent neurobiology evolved precisely to create the behaviors that we pathologize? Can we use our understanding of why these brain differences evolved to promote juvenile justice system that both appreciates and uses these knowledge and insights to create a better system? So here to speak on this are two luminaries. Really, I'm just so grateful that you both are here to speak in the fields of evolutionary biology and juvenile justice. So I'm going to do their intros properly because they deserve it. Marsha Levick is the co-founder and chief legal officer of the Juvenile Law Center, America's first public interest law firm for children. Throughout her career, she's advocated for youth involved in the justice and child welfare systems, and she currently manages the Juvenile Law Center's national litigation docket. Marsha has participated in all of the landmark cases before the Supreme Court that changed the law on whether children are different, including Roper v. Simmons, Graham v. Florida, Miller v. Alabama, Montgomery versus Louisiana. That is quite staggering. She also was involved with JDB versus North Carolina, which requires the consideration of a suspect's youth during police interrogations, in essence, beginning to carve out a jurisdiction for children. Most recently, she led the Juvenile Law Center's litigation arising out of Pennsylvania's Kids for Cash scandal, resulting in the vacatur and expungement of nearly 2,500 juvenile adjudications and financial awards to the youth and their parents. I'm not going to go through every award because that would take the entire program. She is an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, Temple, and University of Pennsylvania Law School, and we are thrilled to have her. Next, I'm going to introduce to you Barbara Natterson-Horowitz. Dr. Horowitz, and if you've been to, Dr. Natterson-Horowitz, if you've been to medical school, this is a terrifying sentence, is a cardiologist and an evolutionary biologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, Harvard University's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, and UCLA School of Medicine. She chairs the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Board on Animal Health Sciences, Conservation, and Research. She is the founder of the pioneering Zubiquity conferences that foster greater collaboration between the fields of human and veterinary medicine. Her books, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, her books are bestsellers. You should buy them at full price. I did not get paid for that endorsement. Zubiquity, which argues for a more species-spanning perspective and approach to human health, and won every award, New York Times bestseller, prize for excellence in science book, and Wildhood, which is based on her Harvard course, Coming of Age on Planet Earth. It was a New York Times Book Review editor's pick and selected Book of the Year by the Association of Science Education. So I would like to begin with Dr. Natterson-Horowitz, and thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm truly thrilled to be here and just learn and learn, and this is a wonderful event, and thank you for that generous bio. I believe that all human challenges, including those that are the most vexing to us, can be better understood and more effectively addressed if we apply broadly comparative lenses, looking across species, and evolutionary lenses. And I've spent the last almost 15 years now developing tools and methodologies for doing that for physical illnesses, psychiatric illnesses, and developmental challenges, including adolescence. So we're going to get started and focus comparative and evolutionary lenses on adolescents. And this, in case you weren't able to spot the adolescents, King Penguin, you can see that the adult plumage is white, right? So it's partially adult, and still the brown plumage, the down of the juvenile. So, and I just love, don't know what it's thinking, but love it. All right. So when it comes to the challenges of adolescence and adolescents in general, we tend to really study humans. Sure, there are a handful of model organisms we use in the lab to understand neurobiology, but The endeavor has been a primarily human-focused work. Most of the work has been human-focused, but I'm not sure that's a good idea. And I would suggest that if we could broaden the window through which we perceive adolescence to include the millions of other animal species with whom we share the earth. And if you just look at vertebrates, so we're looking at fish, amphibian, reptiles, birds, and mammals, there are currently over 100 trillion individual adolescents, excluding humans can be in there somewhere, with whom we share the earth. So there's an opportunity if we begin to think that way. And then if we can open the window one more time to include the evolutionary history that has shaped the various phenotypes. This is the phylogeny that I use to represent the evolutionary history, that if we can do that, we can better understand the vulnerabilities, our understanding of the vulnerabilities of adolescents, and do a better job of coming up with effective strategies, interventions, etc. What are the vulnerabilities of adolescents? This group knows all too well. First of all, there's the physical harm, the risk to life. This is CDC, the death rates, mortality rates between 12 and 19, very sobering picture. We know that there's adolescent vulnerability related to exploitation, many forms of exploitation, trafficking, of course, being one of them. And of course, there is particular vulnerability to mental illness. This is from a meta-analysis that looked at the mean age of onset of a range of mental illnesses. So this is a very vulnerable period. And until this event, I hadn't included this next slide, but I will certainly be doing so now, the unique vulnerabilities and challenges related to engaging with the justice system. So I think I now have 18 minutes, and so here's what I'm going to do. I want to first share a few kind of relevant evolutionary principles, so we're kind of on the same page, and then a little bit about the conserved neurobiology and behavior of adolescents across, and I'm going to really focus on vertebrates. And then just really dive into the examples of how these comparative and evolutionary insights can help us better understand these vulnerabilities. So let's start with the relevant evolutionary kind of information. Okay, so let's imagine that the history of the Earth and life on Earth is a flight between LAX and New York City. Okay, so here we go. So we are going to have, all right, we're going to have the first life single-celled organisms over northern New Mexico, which are going to begin to photosynthesize by western Colorado. But it's not going to be until we are at western Pennsylvania, where we're going to have the multicellularity that sets the stage for animal life, for the first metazoan creatures. And so we're going to be focusing, and I focus all of my research on animals, primarily on vertebrates, occasionally invertebrates. But if you, whoops, that was not what I wanted to do. Here we go. There it is. Okay. So here we go. So now across Pennsylvania, you can see with age of the dinosaurs, the dinosaurian extinction, our common ancestor with chimpanzees, and here we are. We arrive only 570 feet before touchdown in New York City. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that there's only been about 200,000 years, which is a blink. Remember that those common ancestors, right, that western Pennsylvania, that was 600 million years. So this is 200,000 years. While we do have unique characteristics, obviously, right, we share a tremendous amount of common biology, including neurobiology, with other animals. And even though this is obvious on one level, you'd be surprised by how quickly we can forget that and default to the assumption of uniqueness. So I just want to kind of point out that, yes, there are aspects, many, that are uniquely human, but there is a profound and often unrecognized commonality that I think we can really leverage once we see it. And in fact, for our book, Catherine Bowers and I, the brilliant Catherine Bowers, with whom I've written my books, we ended up finding, and it's a long story, but this just shows that if you know how to look for adolescence, you can find it across. This is vertebrates. And we ended up taking, this is some of the animals that we used in the book where we actually characterized the onset of adolescence, which we considered the beginning of puberty, which is kind of a pediatric criteria, and then we had criteria for when a young adult emerged. All right, so now that we've established that adolescence is not uniquely human, let's think about how we can study non-human adolescents to better understand some of the challenges of human adolescence. And one of the frameworks that you can use as an evolutionary biologist is to ask whether a behavior is adaptive or maladaptive. Adaptive would be increasing fitness, maladaptive would be that it does not. And gosh, we hear a lot about how pathological adolescence is, right? The adolescent brain, the hand-wringing that is done, and in fact, the language that's used to describe this sort of underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, et cetera, is underdeveloped, immature, limited ability, inadequate. These are all pathological terms. These suggest maladaptivity. And in fact, if we look at vulnerabilities, what I just showed you, it's a very fair question to ask, is human adolescence maladaptive? Well, we can look across the vertebrate lineage and see whether we can answer that question. So I want to use a parallel, an analogy rather, from medicine, from cardiology, which is my field. There is a condition called vasovagal syncope. So we have all had our blood drawn, many of us have given blood, and you know, some people get really, really, really nervous when it's done, okay? Now, when you are nervous, right, when you're scared of something, what do you expect the heart rate to do? Well, you expect fight or flight. You expect the heart rate to increase. All right, but some people, and for a decade I taught the second-year medical students at UCLA the cardiovascular pathophysiology, and so I used to say, but as you'll see, in some people, occasionally, instead of the heart rate accelerating, there's a slowing of the heart rate, and I used to call that paradoxical. It's the paradoxical bradycardia of vasovagal syncope, but that was before I had my comparative epiphany. Well, it sure does look maladaptive, right, from our perspective. If you have a slowing of the heart rate, which means and the blood vessels dilate, you're not getting enough blood to the brain, and that causes a person to faint. That's the slowing of the heart rate leads to the underperfusion of the brain and fainting. That's not adaptive. That's maladaptive. You could crack your head open, right? Well, let's take a look at what a broad phylogenetic view shows us. And this is one of the first studies that I did when I was interested in this. I was able to find cases of species where there were reports in the peer-reviewed literature in which these species sometimes under certain conditions can have a slowing of the heart rate under fear conditions instead of an accelerated heart rate. And so when you see a characteristic, a trait, broadly across species, one hypothesis is that, maybe there's biological benefit. Maybe that's why this has been conserved. And the adaptive hypothesis that I developed at that time was to say, well, it's interesting that many, many underwater predators hunt by tracking the electrical signal off the prey's heart, right? So and they're equipped with, electroreception. Well, imagine if your prey the heart rate is and all of a sudden it's cut off. What would happen? Well, it's kind of a form of hiding if your predator is tracking the electrical impulse. And in fact, there are a number of there's all kinds of people who've written about fish that when you clean their tanks, they engage in this behavior. Those are fish. Let's go to mammals. So in the late 1970s, there was some interest in this, and some scientists decided to put EKGs on animals, typically young animals, and then in this case, this is a fawn, and then they would drive a truck out with a speaker on top, and they would play recordings of wolves howling, so in order to induce fear. And you can see the heart rate, which starts out at 180 beats per minute as a baseline, with the sound of the wolves howling plummets to 30, and this is the physiology that results. This is the behavior that results. And so it's not too hard to imagine that this could be a form of hiding, right? This is a kind of stillness, particularly if the predator is tracking a rustling of the bushes or has evolved to detect motion visually. So this is a form of hiding, and it's sort of then an anti-predation strategy. What is the evidence for this? Well, I'm going to give you one video. I have many at this point, but this is a good one. The video you're about to see, there is an antelope, an ungulate, who's been taken down by a hyena. The hyena is about to dig in and eat, and a young cheetah comes to see, maybe there's something there for me, and I'm going to narrate as it happens. Okay, the hyena is eating wants the antelope. The cheetah's coming. He's going to go chase off the cheetah. Now I want you to watch the antelope, not the hyena. Watch the antelope. Okay, now I can't prove that this antelope was bradycardic, that the heart rate was low, but that's an example of tonic immobility, and alarm bradycardia is very, very common in ungulates. And in this case, you can see there's this evidence of anti-predation advantage. Is everybody clear on why that physiology might have saved that animal's life, and that would be fitness enhancing? There's a lot more to it, but that's the essence of it. So let's apply that logic, this idea that, okay, maybe we retain physiology that was adaptive in our non-human animal ancestors for a very long period of time. It's maladaptive in us, but there hasn't been enough, 200,000 years is not enough time for that physiology, which is deeply embedded, to be selected against. And so we retain the phenotype of vulnerability to vasovagal syncope. Well, let's apply that logic to adolescence. And we certainly know that there's this stigmatization, this pathologizing of the adolescent brain. I mean, on the one hand, it's a triumph, right, that adolescents that there's something different in the brain, right, that we can move beyond character and will, and we can go to, hey, there's something different about adolescents and adults that you can see in the brain, that you can measure in the brain. So that's sort of validating. At the same time, without a context of why, there is a potential to see it like, there's a tumor in the brain, right? So maybe understanding the why of it, the context, the evolutionary history that has produced that neurobiology, we can better work against pathologizing. And as I mentioned before, there certainly is evidence to suggest that it's maladaptive. Well, let's go ahead and search for the potential adaptive benefits of animal adolescence in animal ancestors. And so for that, we're going to look across species. And so I want to quickly say, this is going to be a lot into one sentence because we don't have time. The adolescent brain is not uniquely human, right? There are differences in the brains of adolescent and young adult fish and adult fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals, all right? This idea that, if an animal is born as a juvenile, it's going to become an adult, and there is development, there is also neurodevelopment, and that neurodevelopment, right, is, as it turns out, important because it is going to be producing the behavior that is necessary for that developmental phase of life, either to keep the animal safe, or one very important key when you're growing up as an animal is learning, is having the experiences that are going to teach you to be an effective adult. And here you can just take a look at, there are the yellow, so the columns are characteristics that we see in human adolescents. So we know that there's increased risk-taking compared to adults, increased risk tolerance when with peers, neophilia, so interest in novelty, and a preference for peers over parents, or using peer, what we call conspecific influence over parental influence. And here are just a few of the many species where there is evidence for each of these in this wide range of animals. So we're talking about guppies, stickleback fish, zebra finches, starlings, gazelle, rats, macaques. Everybody clear on what I'm showing? Okay. Now, I just want to take a moment, 1 second, to say, yes, 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 I know the human brain is unique. Of course, remember, every species is unique. That's the definition of a species. We're not uniquely unique. That's just human exceptionalism. But the point is, yes, there are characteristics of the human brain as compared to our closest, the animal with whom we most recently shared common ancestor, Pan troglodytes, the common chimpanzee. Yes, in the area of our impulse control, emotional regulation, strategic thinking, our ability to have that inner dialogue that can be influential in our decision-making, et cetera, and our ability to ethically reason, okay? Absolutely. But today, we're going to not focus on what's different, we're going to focus on what's common. So let's go ahead and see how some of these characteristics, increased risk-taking or underestimating risk, which is really what it's largely about, impulsivity, increasing risk-taking with conspecific, with peers, neophilia, and the conspecific influence over parents. Let's see how we might understand that comparatively. Well, one thing I want to just mention, I don't know where everybody lives, so I spend most of the year in California, and we have from time to time mountain lions who, I'm in Brentwood, which is near Santa Monica. Occasionally we find mountain lions. You hear about one that's at a shopping mall or at a grocery store, and those are almost always, they're called subadults, so they are adolescents. This was in 2017. I saw this just online, and I reached out to the drone photographer and actually bought this from him. This is an adolescent humpback whale in Ventura County. The point is, when urban wildlife enters into spaces that they shouldn't be, almost all the time, if you pay attention, they'll say subadults, and that is for two reasons. One, they are dispersing, right? They have a neurobiology that is an important adaptive neurobiology that is pushing them out of the natal den, whatever their natal condition is. And they have neophilia, so they're interested in novelty, and they also lack experience. And for that reason, whether it's a humpback whale, this is just a collection. These are the cutest adolescent koala going into an electronics store and a deer going into a liquor store. All right, but those characteristics, that neurobiology that it compels them to, that is pushing them out of the natal burrows and into the world where they need to be from an adaptive perspective, they need that. They're inexperienced, right? When you are big enough as an animal to be, finally, if you're a mammal or a bird where there's parental care, and there's some fish, of course, where there's parental care, but if you are large enough to be outside direct parental care and supervision, but you lack experience, that's a dangerous combination. And in fact, the first study that I did on this issue, I looked at the mortality rates in animals who had just dispersed, and that's a whole fascinating other conversation. But the point is, adolescent animals are inexperienced, and as a result, the wildlife biologists call this predator naive. They're predator naive, which I love that term, and that makes them easy prey. And in fact, in Wildhood, we described about a half dozen predators who specialize, adult predators who specialize on adolescents because they know that they are easy prey. They can trick them. I want to show a really colorful example. I'm going to go quickly so that I'm okay on time. I have another, okay. So the Mara crossing, I have never been. Maybe some of you have. This is one of these world wonders. 1.5 million wildebeest traverse Serengeti. It's this like kind of circular migration. And it's hot and it's dusty, and then they come to the river. And of course, at the river, the crocodiles are there. You may have seen this on Nat Geo, right? And the crocodiles are doing what they do. They're waiting for an opportunity to eat. Now, it's hot, it's dusty, right? They're coming down to the banks of the river, and I'm going to first show you and narrate the wildebeest that leap into the water. Water, okay? I get to drink, I get to swim. And then I'm going to narrate it again. Okay, here we go. So they're coming from the upper right. Okay, so you can see that some of them are jumping in. The ones that jump in are typically, there we go, younger. They're lithe. Can you see there we go. And one jumps in, the other follows. And as you watch this, I cut this down just so we could see the bits that are most relevant. Whoops, hang on a second. I showed you the wrong one. Let me start with this one. This is the one I want to show. Okay. So this is the first one. So you can see the youngsters coming to the shore. You see how thin they are relative to the others. They're not bulky. One jumps, the other jump. They kind of follow each other. Okay. Now, you may already have spotted what I'm going to show you next. But now we're going to look at right here. Okay? I want you to watch the young ones. I want you to watch these bigger, beefier / mature adults and watch what they do at the same place. They're hot, they're thirsty. Okay, I want you to watch this. Okay, do you see this? Yep, he's jumping away. And look at them, they're young and they're excited. This is not their first Mara River crossing. This is experience. And so it's, depending, as you look at wildlife video through the lens of the age, not the size of the animal, because sometimes an adult animal and an adolescent animal are the same size, but their behavior is very different based on experience. Okay. So then the challenge in the wild might be, well, how do you gain experience? I mean, if gaining experience can kill you, how do you gain experience? And there's a fascinating behavior that has been documented across vertebrates. It's even been identified in some invertebrates, but it's been seen in fish, in reptiles, in birds, and in mammals. It's called predator inspection. And it's done, animals of all, adult animals and adolescent animals engage in it, but it's disproportionately subadult and adult animals. This is a group of meerkats and a cobra. And here's what you see. You see one, this is a young one, joined by others. More are going to be coming. And this is a king cobra. So this is a dangerous, dangerous animal for them. And they are, with the safety in numbers, right, they are approaching and smelling and learning about the thing that could harm them. They're doing it collectively. Another wonderful example are cheetahs and Thompson gazelle. So here the Thompson gazelle over here. And you'll see a couple of young ones. I've looked at these videos for hundreds of times, so I can tell who is who. But you can see these cheetahs are in the foreground. Cheetahs are the primary predator for this species. Now, you would expect if you spot a cheetah, what the best thing to do is to run away. But that's not what's happening. You see this young one here approaching, and the other one, and what are they doing? They're staring at the cheetahs. They're staring, they're learning. There are many, many things that you can learn about the most dangerous thing in your life. Now, what's interesting is what is changing in the neurobiology of those Thompson gazelle that's making them willing to do that? What is changing in the neurobiology of those meerkat? When conspecifics, when peers come together, when animal peers come together, their risk-taking threshold gets lower. And you can see that that would be adaptive. So if it's important from a learning perspective to engage in predator inspection, then having a lowered threshold to take risk would be a pretty important adaptive strategy. Of course, and what is the evidence for this? One thing I just want to mention, this is an amazing study that was done by a woman, Claire Fitzgibbons, in the 80s. She counted predator inspection, like actual episodes, and disproportionately they were done by subadults and adults. And when adolescents engaged in it, the death rate was 1 in 400, so there was a risk. But the ones who became mature adults, the death rate went down to 1 in 5,000. So there's clear evidence that predator inspection, at least in the Thompson gazelle and cheetah, really helps. Well, perhaps this is I had a conversation with Lawrence Steinberg about this before Wildhood was published, and we were sort of talking about the statistics, right? That we all know when we have kids, they're not allowed to drive with peers without an adult for, I don't know, 6 months or a year. And I sort of wonder whether the lowered threshold to take a risk when you have conspecifics with you, if that, which we see across a phylogenetically wide range of animals, whether that is a legacy in humans, whether that's a legacy. Well, let's go back to the characteristics and focus on conspecifics, and I'm going to be wrapping up in just a minute or two. And let's talk about preference for being with conspecifics. What does that mean? That is the urge, the pull, the lure of peers. Conspecific is peers. There are a couple of studies there are many really interesting studies that look at, animal studies that look at this, but there are two that really hit me when I read them. The first has to do with, is not surprising actually, but when a rat is with mom, right, it's going to adopt mom's food preferences. That is not very surprising at all. At day 42, however, at adolescence, when you move the rat into an enclosure with conspecifics who have a different food choice, they sniff their whiskers to determine what they're eating, and they instantly shift to what the conspecifics are eating. So, all those 42 days of excellent maternal influence has no impact. It changes. And it's interesting to wonder why that might be. And one hypothesis that makes a lot of sense to me is that it may be that neurobiology has evolved to reflect a reality, what may be a reality, that conspecifics living outside the natal burrow or den may have more up-to-date information about the world in terms of both threats and opportunities than you have, than your mother had. And so there may be and actually, for a couple of reasons it makes a lot of sense to me. Just to even strengthen the rapidity with which the shift is made, well, that's interesting. But here's kind of the mind-blowing second experiment. When the mouse as a juvenile is exposed to 3 different food choices. One choice is tasty, it's palatable. The other choice is unsalted and not very palatable. And the third choice, when he eats it, they put some, I forget what it is, it makes them nauseated and they vomit. So it's not surprising, 100% of the rats prefer the palatable diet. Now, at 42 days, if you move them in with conspecifics, who've been trained in different ways. So if you move them in with conspecifics who prefer palatable, they keep eating palatable. If you move them with conspecifics who've been trained on unpalatable, they instantly switch from eating palatable to unpalatable, unsalted, even though they have access to the more tastier stuff. But the mind-blowing thing is that they will do the same thing. They will shift from their preference to the preference that makes them sick, that made them sick as juveniles if the others are doing it. And that's instant. So that to me is like really, really interesting in terms of the power of that neurobiology that is telling them this is a really important decision, that this is the right decision to make. Finally, there are a couple of other things we don't have time to talk about. There's something called the conformity effect, which is a safety strategy. And from an evolutionary perspective, one of the reasons we see so much similarity in the phenotype of animals who travel in packs and flocks and herds. These are, of course, starlings engaged in murmurations or anchovies. And that is because the conformity effect, it's hard for predators to pick out a single individual when you have the kind of, everything looks the same. And odd-looking individuals, called the oddity effect, are targeted by predators. And interestingly, when fish self-assort, they will self-assort for similarity, because the groups that have the odd-looking fish are more targeted. So that's a whole other kind of interesting thing to consider. So finally, I want to share an experiment I've been working on in Norway with Marco Vindas. We've been looking at adolescent vulnerability to depression. Rainbow trout, a number of fish are used as species to study depression. What we do is we take trout that are the same age, they're from the same clutch, okay, so they are siblings. And they're prepubertal, so they haven't quite entered adolescence, but they're about to. And we put them into a tank. One is 20% bigger in size than the other, and we see what happens. And we know that social defeat is a potent inducer of depression in zebrafish, in mice, and probably in humans as well. Well, you can see that some of these fish, the ones that are a little bit smaller, within 3 days, you can see the darker color, the much less motion. They are very vulnerable. These are, remember, siblings. These are all from the same clutch. Some of them are profoundly vulnerable. This, the transcriptional signature, the brain transcriptome of this fish is identical to, or pretty much aligns with a human who has neurovegetative depression. On the other hand, there are some fish who Marco calls the coping fish. And yes, they learn how to stay out of the way, but they really do not become depressed. So it's just, what's the difference between these fish? I don't know, but somehow we say, yes, there's genetic differences in vulnerability to depression, there's genetic differences in vulnerability to fill in the blank. But somehow when you see it in a non-human animal, in a fish, for me, it's more profound. So I'll end with Bowlby because, so John Bowlby, of course, was the father of attachment theory, and he wrote a paper in 1947 based on his study of orphans from World War I. He studied people young adults who had been during World War I, their parents had been killed. They were in orphanages, and he commented on how a disproportionate number of them were thieves. Not politically correct to say today, but it was called, this very famous paper called 44 Juvenile Thieves. And the story goes that Bowlby saw this, but he was developing attachment theory, but he needed a scientific basis for it. He didn't have it. And somebody said to him, there's this guy outside of Vienna in Altenburg, and he's working with these geese and something called imprinting. So John Bowlby went and hung out for the summer with Konrad Lorenz, who was one of the animal behaviorists who won the Nobel Prize for animal behavior in medicine in 1973. And it was from avian imprinting that human attachment theory was born. So when the pandemic struck, I had a bunch of students who had nothing to do. So that was when I started my lab. And we studied, I was really interested, let's look at what happens to dogs if they're separated from mom too early, horses and cats. And in fact, not surprisingly, in all of these mammalian species, premature separation from mom increased aggression. In the case of dogs, because of that aggression during adolescence, it increases the chances of them being relinquished, which in most states equals in most shelters, that is death. So I'll end with a tribute to the natural world as a source of insights for human challenges. Charles Darwin himself wrote that natural selection is a power incessantly ready for action. By the way, this is young Darwin, right? Not with the beard. Why am I showing that? And immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts, because although human adolescence has been pathologized, the adolescent brain is capable of fantastic creativity and accomplishment, and based on our definition of adolescence today, including the length, when the brain has completed its development, Charles Darwin was an adolescent when he stepped on board the Beagle. Thank you very much.
So, that made me feel breathless. Anyway, happy to be here, very much so. Thank you for inviting both of us. What a really fascinating lead-in that is. And as I was listening, I will say that the thing that really jumped out at me as a lawyer who is utilizing adolescent developmental traits as a way of actually protecting them is to go back to your early comments about, and which you repeated, which is that we tend to think about the traits of adolescence, we humans in this space, as pathology. We pathologize them. Well, here's the thing. If we didn't pathologize them, we probably wouldn't be where we are today in getting them better treatment in our justice system. I really think that what has happened is that, so I know this is like a mixed room. Some of you are lawyers, some of you are judges, some of you I know are working in federal probation, some of you are probably education. So I'm going to say stuff, and some of it will be new to you, and some of it will be incredibly boring to you. What I want to share is that the juvenile justice system in the United States is 126 years old. It was founded in 1899, was the first juvenile court in Cook County, Illinois. And that court was created out of an intuitive sense that kids were different. It was not created based on the scientific research and scientific vocabulary that we all have today. Each of us are, in our own way, little neuroscientist 101s now. But there was certainly this innate understanding that there's something different about kids. Adolescence was not really so much a thing in 1899. But the court was created to allow for children to be treated differently, and the way that it was thought about then was a little bit of a medical model. It was about, we're going to treat, we're going to fix juvenile crime. There's also a more conservative view about how it was also about really encouraging newly arrived immigrant children who were misbehaving on the streets of Chicago and other urban areas in the country to get them to really assimilate to whatever we thought sort of civil society should look like. So, you know, fast forward 125 years, and what has happened over the course of the history of the juvenile justice system is that we have always been open to treating many children as adults. From the very beginning of the juvenile court, we were willing, and I'm using this word willing very intentionally, we were willing to disregard what were obvious differences between children and adults and punish them and treat them harshly, because I would also say that what's very baked into American criminal justice culture, American juvenile justice culture, is a very punitive, retributive philosophy. So if somebody acts out badly, we think we need to do something harsh in response to that conduct. And that response and the need to be retributive really trumps what we know about that 13, 14, or 15-year-old, because we're most concerned with kind of punishing them. And so jump into the 21st century, and Judith talked about some of these Supreme Court cases that were decided in sort of the aughts and over the course of the last 20 years. And I am going to go through this really fast because I would love for folks to have an opportunity to ask some questions. Is that we began to see a series of challenges to really harsh sentencing of young people in this country. The most extreme sentencing, the death penalty, life without parole imposed on teenagers who had been convicted of non-homicide crimes, not violent crimes, life without parole imposed on individuals who had been convicted of homicide crimes. And then sort of around the edges of that, how would we impose, implement, withdraw the imposition of those sentences, under what circumstances? And also, as Judith mentioned in her opening remarks, this case JDB versus North Carolina, which was an opportunity for the U.S. Supreme Court to take the research that became really prominent in the academy and then in all of our conversations, the teenage brain on the cover of Teen Magazine, what more do you need to know? That notion about the teen brain developing in a way that it was not fully developed until age 25 or 26, so I didn't realize that Darwin was an adolescent. That was an interesting piece of information. You know, we began to understand that research was driving a different way of thinking about how we respond to criminal behavior by young people, including the most horrific criminal behavior, such as murder. And What's so fascinating about the research that you have described and the research that you're doing is that, of course, the traits that you had up on your slide in terms of risk-taking and taking more risks with peers, the kind of, you call it neophilia, which is novel things, all of that, since I think Dr. Steinberg would, I think, use the term sensation-seeking, is how he would talk about that. All of those traits and characteristics of adolescents apparently around the world in every kingdom. They are the same among teenage adolescents, among human adolescents, and the US Supreme Court accepted those characteristics as a justification for finally treating children differently, again, not just by creating a separate court for them, but by creating a separate sentencing system for them. Now, I want to go back to what I opened my remarks with, which is to say, the thing is that if we didn't talk about these characteristics of adolescence as being impairments, we wouldn't be where we are today. Because the way that the Supreme Court got to its ultimate decisions that these extreme sentences could be banned for teenagers. We're not up to very much anyone over the age of 18, although some state Supreme Courts, including here in Massachusetts, have banned extreme sentencing for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. The way the court got there was to literally view their characteristics as impairing their ability to premeditate, to engage with counsel so that they could ensure that they received effective assistance of counsel by participating in conversations with counsel, describing what they did, possibly not really realizing they might have a defense of self-defense, but being able to describe that well. All of these were things that the Supreme Court saw as, aha, this makes them less able, this makes them less capable, this makes them less guilty, less culpable for their crimes. And so it is an impairment analysis that gets us to the less blameworthy and less culpable. And if we suddenly started talking about them as kind of positive attributes that enable them to carry on the species, that enable them to figure out where the danger lies and how to manage that danger the next time that they see it, we'd probably be in a very different spot. And as I said, I'm so grateful for sitting here and listening to you, because I hadn't really thought that that mattered in how we talked about it. But it's very clear to me that it is that. That is the thing that got us here. The other point that I want to make, kind of for the lawyers and judges and probation folks in the room, and this will be me editorializing. This is me speaking some of the concerns I have about the justice system in the U.S. As I said, it's very punitive, it's very retributive. The ways in which we have been able to challenge extreme sentencing of young people in this country is through the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The thing about the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment under our federal Constitution is that if you read a lot of Eighth Amendment cases that the Supreme Court has issued, as I have done, what you discover is that the Eighth Amendment has a very high tolerance for cruelty. And it is easy to punish people extremely in the United States, and there is not a lot of redress for that under our constitutional framework. We are not signatories, we have not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and various other UN conventions which are centered on human rights and human dignity concepts. That does not exist in our Constitution, and it doesn't really surface and play a very prominent role in our punishment jurisprudence in this country. So I say that because what I believe not only has the notion of thinking about young people as impaired been a bonus in eliminating harsh sentences, what has also happened in the United States is that the dominance now of developmental psychology and neuroscience has actually enabled us to overcome, it's almost like a proxy for human rights, is what I would say. That because we don't have a human rights framework in this country, the ways in which we have been able to mitigate the most extreme punishments for young people is through this scientific analysis, through this scientific lens. What does that mean, kind of thinking about this work going forward? Unclear. Up until very recently, I would have said, the science is a science. It's uncontroverted. There's nobody on the other side. Who's going to say this isn't really true? And your research makes it even truer, in a sense. But what I think we've also seen recently, of course, is that jurisprudence turns out to be a bit more flexible and fluid than we might have otherwise thought it was as lawyers. And so I am not sure necessarily what the future holds. I'll speak to the lawyers or judges in the room right now. I will say that we have made extraordinary strides with the United States Supreme Court in the last 20 years. I think this forward progress is at a standstill right now there. But there are enormous opportunities in state Supreme Courts with their own state constitutional provisions, which have their own textual differences that allow for different applications and different interpretations. And so I think that there is a great opportunity. Maybe it's like the state Supreme Courts have been adolescents, and now they're coming into their adulthood. And I see great opportunity for them, now that they're mature, to make some differences. That's where kind of Juvenile Law Center is pivoting. But we could go on and on. This is so rich. I feel very fortunate to have learned so much from you just in the last half hour. But I want to stop there to give people a chance for questions.
Can I just ask a question? So, but when I think, so I would say that adolescence animal adolescence is adaptive for animals in the wild context, and maybe maladaptive if they're not in that wild, and that many of those characteristics are maladaptive, so are pathological in modern humans. But what I think the piece of it that I didn't say, but when we're talking about it, it's that understanding the why of the adolescent brain, it for me underscores the intensity, the life or deathness of the urge that the neurobiology is producing. What we observe is the behavior of, I need to be with those other people my age, even though my mother, whom I love, is saying don't do it. It allows me to kind of get into how powerful that urge would be. So almost like it's a state dependence, even though it's not a pathology that it's going to shift. The way I think about, we were talking about me walking by, if I'm just walking by a store, if I were starving to death, how my behavior walking by the grocery store might be different. Like it just provides kind of a context of what the drive would be.
Well, and I think also your very last slide, or one of the last slides where you talked about the premature loss of attachment, I think and you, I think, have talked about this too, Judith, which is about how there are a lot of similar experiences that teens and young adults have had who have been engaged in criminal behavior. We could talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that make some more likely than others. I mean, one of the things, and we talked about this when we were preparing for this program, 95% of kids don't commit crimes, and yet they are engaging in low-level, non-criminal, maybe nobody finds out about it, misbehavior driven by the traits that you identified that are common across species. But there are other things, obviously, we would like to think that have a role at the so-called super developed level of our human brain. But yeah, I mean, we could go on and on.
Would anyone like to ask questions? We have a few minutes to entertain what kind of questions you would like. And someone, please, if you could say your discipline.
Oh, hi, I'm Angela Martinez. I'm a district judge in Arizona. One of the thoughts that came to my mind when you were talking about how, I can't remember your term, but basically the adolescents were taking these risks. How, for example, in the river crossing or any group setting,
that's a really interesting question. You're asking about the parenting style of how safety behavior is being imparted from parent to child?
Yes, or even herd discipline. And
Yeah.
part of that kind of goes into both of what you're talking about. One is sort of impulsivity that puts the adolescent at risk, but also if there's antisocial behavior in the adolescent that impacts the wellness of the herd. How is the herd responding to that? Have you studied that?
I have not looked specifically at the wildebeest. The one thing that is interesting about parenting and outcomes, bird parents, for example, they are more likely to lose their offspring. And in the video, I don't know if you saw, I was going quickly, the young gazelle that's wandered into the water in the alligator, the crocodile. Did you see that one?
No.
Okay, well, I went back to, okay, the point is that a parent Thompson gazelle who is not mature and experienced is more likely to lose their offspring. So in other words, if the offspring is if you imagine the offspring is the adolescent, that having a more mature parent, however that safety behavior is being transmitted, statistically, there's going to be a better outcome. And an immature parent is more likely to have a young adult or adolescent offspring. They may not even make it there, but
Please. This is a little bit of a windy road question, thoughts, so bear with me. I'm Carrie Fiber. I'm the alum of the Risk and Prevention Program for the School of Education, which is a systems-based approach to risk resiliency, risk and prevention. And I run a consultancy local to local, and I cross a lot of disciplines, but I used to develop programs for youth as a part of my wheelhouse, I guess you could say. I was an at-risk youth myself, which I had my own what I call risk expression, and it got me thinking about the expression of risk factors. So right now, I'm working with the MIT Sloan Prison Education project teaching entrepreneurship curriculum to prisoners, virtually and in person. And I'm thinking about when people act out in a crime, it's very creative, whatever it is. And when I started working in the private sector, my first project was with cyber. I was selling cybersecurity around the world, but I was thinking about who are the hackers, why are they hacking, et cetera, et cetera. So I started interviewing cage designers as a sort of a form of hacking. So anyway, I'm just thinking about programming interventions using the notion of creativity and the risk expressions. So how can you help that young person express what we're talking about, but in creative ways? And it could be all kinds of different arenas, and it could tie into employment. There's a whole lot of things that tie into my wondering. So I think somehow it ties into what you're discussing, even when I was watching these animals, right? And so it's really cool to see some of these prisoners. We went to a prison 2 hours away, and we were talking about leadership, and we were discussing a business case, and it was really thoughtful discussion. And we did it not in this pedantic way, but more in a community way. But it's part of their treatment program, I guess you could say. So that's my windy road kind of story and question, wondering about creativity and innovation in the mix of all this. Any thoughts?
I mean, what I would say, I'm very curious to know what you would say. I would say that I think that this notion of risk-taking and sensation-seeking means that they have fewer kind of boundaries and guardrails as adolescents and young adults. So the willingness to try something that as we get older, we're like, oh, that's not going to work, so why would I do that? I think that teens, I would think they don't have that preconceived notion of that's the thing that won't work. They have no idea, and they're just willing to try it. So that might be feeding into that creativity, and why I think also, I think this is true factually, that most programmers are actually, they kind of exceed when they're really young, and, kind of falls away as they get older. But what's your sort of biological?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interest. I want to think about the creativity piece, but the one thing that resonates there is just the where an adolescent, human or animal, human or non-human animal, is going to, I mean, how much danger there actually is in which that neurobiology is going to be acting. So it's really interesting. If you look at the mortality rates, there are two populations of, big populations of spotted hyenas in Africa. One is the Ngorongoro Crater near Tanzania, and the other is the Serengeti. And they're very different terrain. So in the Serengeti, there's like, there's much less prey, and the predators are more dangerous. And in Ngorongoro, there's much more prey. So it's a safer, and the outcomes are as you would expect that they would be. And so although I haven't looked specifically at the risk-taking, you would make a prediction that they would be, with more resources, they would be taking fewer risks.
Hi, my name is Christina. My background is in public defense in Australia. And I was wondering if any of the research you've looked at in evolutionary biology space had looked at the intersection of this adolescent period with trauma, and maybe wondering if the last slide you showed about aggression, like how those pieces interact. Asking because in my experience as a good judge, I'm like perfect kid in sort of like the judge's eyes. They're kind of open to some of these narratives, not fully understood or fleshed out. But the minute you complicate that with a trauma background or something, then it immediately becomes much more pathologized in the way that we were speaking about.
The trauma connection that I mean, I thought the findings of that little study were just fantastic and really, but when we think about, let's just think about kind of trauma PTSD. Okay, so early life trauma PTSD, and let's imagine that this is trauma pre-adolescence, so we're dealing with an adolescent who's had childhood trauma, something like that. We know that it is very adaptive for animal neurobiology, has a plasticity to it such that when there is a traumatic event, there are going to be neurobiological changes that's going to result in behavior, and behavior that would be adaptive in the wild. So if it results, they've studied fish who have been caught in those trawling nets but have gotten out, so they're too small, they weren't the prey that the fishermen wanted, and they've actually looked at how that's a very traumatic, that's a restraint, a near-death experience, and they're forevermore, they are withdrawn, right? They're going to hang out near the shore, they aren't going to take as many chances, so it has a profound effect on their behavior. Now, that may be adaptive for them because it's teaching them about the world. That traumatic event is saying, hey, this is a really dangerous place you're living in. And early on, right, the brain is more plastic, it's taking it in, it's imprinting. And it may be really important if he remains in that dangerous place that he retain that behavior. Obviously, if we retain that neurobiology, that's maladaptive for us. But that's my connection to thinking about sort of the importance for animals of a profound behavioral response to trauma, even though it's so challenging for us.
We're running out of time. We can take one more question in the back, and then if you would like to come down afterwards, that would be lovely.
Hi, my question is specifically regarding birds, songbirds, and specifically the mirror neurons, which allow them to kind of mimic and refine themselves in terms of how they interact with others. And I was wondering if there was anything that you could tell us about risk-taking in adolescents and helping study the mirror neurons of songbirds.
I'm not an expert on it, but last week I was in Germany at the animal behavior meetings, and Michael Goldstein from Cornell, who does the songbird the acquisition of, he looks at babies and birds and how they acquire language. And one thing that I took away was that they prefer, the young birds will always prefer the dialect of the conspecific over the parent. So I don't have any knowledge beyond that, but I thought that was really interesting.
I'm so sorry that we have to end things. I could be here all afternoon, and I share the feeling that you all could be as well. I want to thank Susanna Baruch and everyone at the Petrie-Flom Center. I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Barbara Natterson-Horowitz and attorney Marsha Levick. Thank you all for coming. We're going to be here for a few more minutes if you have questions, and I appreciate all of you being here today.